Good morning or afternoon, wherever you are, and welcome to the origins of the Cold War. So today we are looking at how this war that lasts for a very, very long time actually gets started. So this conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. So the last original meeting of the Big Three took place at Yalta in February of 1945 before FDR died. And that was whenever we start to see things beginning to fall apart. So let's look at the sources of tension between the Soviet Union and the United States. So one of the first things we have to talk about is the ideology and personality of the people involved. So at its heart, for a lot of people who are involved in this is about the huge clash between communism and capitalism. Now, under communism, there's this belief that communism will inevitably replace capitalism. And this helped make Stalin very suspicious of the United States. On the other hand, the United States sees a dictatorship in the Soviet Union. No freedom of speech or religion. But for the Soviets, you're supposed to keep rich people from exploiting the poor, and that's not what's happening in the U.S. We also have to look at personality. Truman hated communism, and he's very unwilling to negotiate. And Stalin is less willing to work with Truman than he was with FDR. So some of this just comes right down to personality. We also have some trust issues and security matters coming out of World War II. So both countries had reasons to be suspicious of each other after World War II. There was this whole Second Front controversy. So the Soviet Union had wanted the U.S. and Great Britain to open up a second front in France for years. And in the Soviet eyes, the U.S. and Great Britain drug their feet. Now that wasn't the case. That wasn't what was really happening, but the Soviets believed that or rather Stalin believed that particularly Great Britain was just hoping that the Nazis would take out the Soviets and then the US and Great Britain would defeat the Nazis after the Soviets had already been defeated. So that's a cause for suspicion. But the US had reason not to trust the Soviet Union. So in 1939, the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact was signed. Now, for a very short time, Stalin and Hitler had an agreement. But here's the thing. Stalin knew that Nazi Germany was eventually going to attack. He was trying to buy time to prepare for war. But for the U.S., this is evidence that the Soviets can't be trusted because they were allies of the Nazis and they weren't. So, also look at these numbers. 600,000 U.S. military people lost their lives in World War II. 20 to 25 million Soviets were killed. 25 million were homeless. They're terrified of another war. Stalin talked tough, but he was bluffing. The Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. They want Eastern Europe as a buffer zone. It would make it difficult to invade in the future, and so they set up puppet governments in Eastern Europe to try to create that buffer zone. The U.S. sees a dictator moving into Eastern Europe, thinking that they're going to take Western Europe too, even though that's not what was actually happening. So this is both sides kind of talking past each other. There's also the issue of decolonization. The colonial empires of Europe were losing control of their colonies. There were 125 new independent countries after World War II, places like India, Vietnam, Korea, and pretty much all of Africa. U.S. and Soviet Union are competing for influence. Are these places going to be allied with the U.S. or with the Soviet Union? And are there new governments? Are they going to be capitalist or communist? So they're competing for all of these new countries in terms of adding them to their list of allies. On top of that, we see the Chinese Revolution in 1949. So China becomes communist. This was a part of a civil war that had gone back to the 1920s. The turmoil of World War II had allowed the communists under Mao Zedong to gain the upper hand. This dramatically increases the number of people living under communism. So now it's spread to it's spread to Asia, and so the fear of communism dominating the world seems a lot more realistic. And it's a political disaster for Harry Truman. He had sent a ton of money to the Chinese government to try to prevent this revolution from happening. $3 billion went to China, and it looks like Truman's fault in a way for wasting all this money. And to make matters worse, this is the same year that the Soviet Union develops the atomic bomb. So 1949 was pretty much a watershed year for the Cold War. So how do you deal with communism? How do you keep it from spreading? So the U.S. is trying to do basically whatever it can to keep countries from falling to communism. And a big part of that is something called the Marshall Plan. So the idea of the Marshall Plan is that you spend money. So the United States would spend $15 billion to rebuild Western Europe. It goes to Germany, to Great Britain, France, Italy, Belgium. You want to make sure that these countries are prosperous capitalist nations. You help them solve their humanitarian crisis, and that way stable countries don't get any kind of interest in communism. This provides a foothold for U.S. corporations in Europe to, also help with the U.S. after economy post-war. So this does a couple of things. It's basically trying not to recreate what happened after World War I, where Germany's economy was destroyed and therefore Hitler was able to rise. So you want your countries to be stable, and also they're not going to be as interested in communism or socialism if they've been rebuilt by a capitalist country. So the Marshall Plan, it's named after the Secretary of State at the time, George Marshall, is a way to fight communism. It's part of the Cold War. But the official term for our foreign policy whenever it comes to communism is containment. So this is the idea that you can't do anything where communism already exists. It's just not practical. But you can try to keep it from spreading. So containment comes from a man named George Kennan. He had been a diplomat in Moscow in the 1930s, and he really loved it and came to really enjoy Russia. But as tensions worsened, Kennan argued that Stalin was irrational. You can't negotiate with him. So this is in something called the Long Telegram, where he talks about how to deal with the Soviet Union. And there's a snippet from the Long Telegram here. So all the government wants is to expand Soviet power, and so it's possible to push back because at the heart they're just bullies. They want to bring in as many people as possible, but you can fight back. Isolationism is no longer an option. The United States must be a leader in this containment. This becomes the basis for all U.S. foreign policy for the next 50 years. You try to build economic relationships with countries. You try to build political relationships with countries to keep communism from spreading. So that's what containment is. So a part of containment is the Truman Doctrine. So containment is kind of the big umbrella, and the Truman Doctrine fits underneath it. This says that the U.S. will come to the aid of any country threatened by communism. Inside or outside threat, it doesn't matter. And he had two countries in mind. So Greece was in the middle of a civil war, and the U.S. gave money to Greece's government in order to resist the communist revolutionaries. Turkey, on the other hand, was being pressured by an outside threat by the Soviet Union, which wanted access to the Mediterranean Sea through Turkey. So the U.S. gave money to Turkey so the Soviet Union would know the U.S. was supporting and protecting Turkey. So basically saying we are watching and we are supporting Turkey, and we will protect them if necessary. And so the Soviet Union backs down in Turkey. The Berlin crisis is where we see the Cold War start to get kind of hot. So there was a fear the economic crisis after World War II will lead Germany to communism. The best way to stop that is to make Germany a prosperous, democratic ally of the U.S. Stalin, on the other hand, does not want that to happen. He thinks that the U.S. will use Germany as a launching point. He also wants to crush Germany. Think about how Britain and France felt after World War I. He feels that way. He's lost 20 to 25 million people. He wants to eliminate Germany's military, make it as weak as possible, so it will never, ever threaten anyone ever again. This is about revenge. So after the war was over, Germany was divided into 4 parts: British, French, US, and Soviet. And the capital, Berlin, was also divided into 4 parts. So there's a question of how long do we stay? The Western powers start to build up their parts of Germany, stabilize their government, stabilize their economy, but the Soviet zone does the opposite, because remember, they want to crush them. The Western parts consolidated their section into the new country of Western Germany in 1948. They set up a new constitution. Stalin, though, does not agree to withdraw, and his zone becomes Eastern Germany. But what about Berlin? Berlin is deep in Eastern Germany. Should the US, Great Britain, and France give up their zones? If they did, they would be allowing the people of West Berlin, to fall to communism. And they are committed to containment. And it's not just the US. Great Britain was very much committed to this as well. They want West Berlin, even though it's in the middle of East Germany, to be part of West Germany. And they refuse to leave. So Stalin shuts off all transport in and out of West Berlin. The only way to get supplies in and out was the airlift. So for 1 year, the US, Great Britain, and France, and West Germany flew things in. And they literally dropped food and supplies into West Berlin. Planes that had dropped bombs on Berlin not too long before were dropping, life-sustaining supplies. It becomes the symbol of determination to resist communism, and in 1949, Stalin realizes he can't get the West to back down. He's not willing to go to war over it either. So you end up with West Germany and East Germany, and then East Berlin and West Berlin. So this is also important because it's clear that if Western Europe and the US stay together, they can keep the Soviet Union boxed in and they will back down. And so this leads to the founding of NATO, the alliance of Western Europe and the United States. So NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And basically the idea behind NATO is that if you attack one member, you attack them all. And if one of the countries is attacked, they can invoke this charter that founded NATO, and all the other countries have to go to war with them. This has only been done once, and it didn't happen during the Cold War. It happened after 9/11. The US invoked this charter and said that we've been attacked, come to our aid, and they did. Okay, so another part of the Cold War confrontations that we see is the Korean War. So the Korean War stands on its own as a war, but it's also part of the Cold War, as Vietnam is. So the Korean War is part of this broader effort to prevent the spread of communism. It's an example of the US and the Soviet Union fighting over influence in a decolonized place. Korea had been a colony of Japan. Both the US and the Soviet Union had sent troops there to fight the Japanese. The US wants Korea allied with them, but of course so do the Soviets. There were US troops in the south and there were Soviet troops in the north at the end of the war. They each set up their own puppet governments. And basically, by 1949, there was no resolution in sight. So they divided the country in half in 1949. Now, the Koreans want to be one country. And so in June of 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. And they're trying to unify the country under communism because some people there really, really liked it. Now, this starts a civil war. Now, the US thought that the Soviet Union had given North Korea the order to do this, but in reality, Stalin was mad. He didn't want to fight. The Soviet Union is not ready. And so, on the US side, we've made a promise to come to the aid of those threatened by communism. The Truman Doctrine means that we are committed to helping South Korea. And so Truman goes to war without permission from Congress. This is the first time a U.S. president has ever done this, but it's definitely not the last. So it's sending forces based on this containment idea, working through the United Nations, which had been set up after the war. The UN condemned North Korea's actions, and Truman says that it's justified to send troops because of containment and protecting South Korea. So Congress does sign off on this. So Truman has gone beyond what the Constitution allows him to do, and ever since, no president has ever asked for a declaration of war from Congress, not in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. So this is part of this theme of not just the expansion of the government, but the expansion of the presidency. So the troops are supposed to come in and push North Korea out of the South, but it's a surprisingly close war. North Korea is getting money and supplies from the Soviet Union, but not troops. Because if they sent troops, there would have been a possibility that this could escalate into World War III and nuclear war if actual troops were sent. The Chinese, on the other hand, did send troops, but in Korean uniforms because they thought the U.S. was too racist to tell the difference. So, in terms of strategy, the general in charge of this war was a man named Douglas MacArthur, who had served in World War II. And he hated the idea of containment. He wanted to continue pushing the communists out of Korea completely. You defeat North Korea altogether and you unite the country as a capitalist democracy. You take out the government of China while you're at it. And he asked Truman for permission to use nukes on China. Truman said no, and MacArthur went public with his criticisms. Said Truman was too much of a wuss and you must take out communism completely. He got fired, but his ideas were much more popular than Truman was. The U.S. public favored MacArthur. In fact, when he comes home, he's given a huge parade. But there's no way that the U.S. could fight this war without the risk of nuclear war with the Chinese and the Soviet Union. And so the war ends in pretty much a tie in 1953. It's a stalemate. And no, when I say that the war ends, it doesn't technically end. It's we don't have a treaty that ends it. Technically, the Korean War is still happening. We just are in the middle of a peace fire. So if you're a veteran, you are also a veteran of the Korean War, even if you didn't serve from 1950 to 1953. And obviously, we still have issues with North Korea to this day. So, as you might expect, Truman was pretty unpopular after this. So unpopular that he doesn't even bother running for re-election in 1952. We did achieve the original goal, which was to push North Korea out of South Korea, and we still have this split to this day. So these are the Cold War confrontations that we see take place in terms of foreign affairs. And in the next PowerPoint, we will look at what fighting communism means for 1950s society and 1950s culture at home in general.